Welcome everyone to Marquette University Law School, Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Goucher, and on behalf of Dean Joseph Kearney, we are delighted you could join us for the 2016 Restorative Justice Conference. The law school prides itself on being a community convener, of bringing people into this building to have serious civil conversations about issues that affect us all, and certainly domestic violence affects us all. This year's conference is designed to bring together survivors, community members, lawyers, teachers, social workers, students, and others to learn about domestic violence and about pathways to healing. By looking at this issue through a restorative justice lens, this conference will raise awareness of the magnitude of the domestic violence problem, and we hope that it will generate ideas on how each of us can engage in helping repair the harm and address the social, cultural, and economic causes of the problem. And now, to help lay the foundation for the next day and a half, I am honored to introduce Janine Geske. As many of you in this room know, Janine helped establish the Restorative Justice Initiative at this law school back in 2004. She is a former Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice. She is a retired distinguished professor of law at this university, and she is currently a member of the Marquette University Board of Trustees. She is also, I'm pleased to say, a good friend. So won't you please welcome Janine Geske. Janine.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everybody. I am very excited about this conference, and I'm so glad all of you have come, and we'll have another full room tomorrow. Many of you will return at that time. As Mike mentioned, I've been involved in restorative justice one way or another probably for close to 20 years now, and many people have heard me talk about the fact that when I was a circuit court judge, a trial court judge in Milwaukee, and I first heard about restorative justice, my initial reaction was, that is the craziest thing I ever heard. Why would a victim of a crime, and I was sitting in homicide court or hearing sexual assaults or armed robbery cases, why would a victim ever want to sit across a table like this and talk to somebody who had terrorized them or their family members? And so I had no interest in it, and it took an experience in a prison of all places for me to learn exactly what restorative justice was and what it wasn't, and how, in fact, it can lead to healing in the right cases, under the right circumstances, with the right people. And so I have been involved, and this law school has been involved in restorative justice in a lot of fields for the last 15 years or so. We've done victim offender dialogues in crimes of severe violence. We've run a program at Green Bay Correctional Students Institute, which is going on next week, and we have 10 law students that participate in that, and we work with 25 offenders and 3 survivors of violent crime and community members. We've worked with juveniles. We've worked on issues of bullying and human trafficking and lots of the clergy sex abuse and lots of issues. One of the areas that everyone always said you couldn't use restorative justice was domestic violence. Stay away from domestic violence. And I understood that. I understood that in part because I had my initial concerns about restorative justice, and I understood that in terms of the movement and how we were trying to protect survivors, give them a safe environment, have them have support in the court system, have the treatment both for those who were convicted of the crime, but also for those who needed support as survivors and family members. And my good friend Carmen Petre and Terry Stodoff, who you'll hear from in a little while, and I had talked about this for some time, but it was always don't go, they weren't saying this, but don't go into domestic violence. What I'd like to do is, and I'm going to spend just about 20 minutes, for those of you who don't know what restorative justice is, some of you know, but I want to give you that foundation before you hear some of the speakers so you have some sense of what that is. And we'll talk more about it. The concept of restorative justice is really to look at harm through a different lens. It's not the traditional criminal justice lens, and this doesn't mean the criminal justice system's not applied. It can be used with the system or without the system. But when we look at the system, it's all about, was there a crime committed? Who did it? Is there enough evidence to convict them beyond a reasonable doubt? And what do we do with the offender? That's what it's about. And we've given victims rights through the years to be able to be heard, to be in a courtroom, but most of the rights that victims get in our court system are the right to know what's happening to the offender. I mean, that's the right, and a bit of a voice at sentencing. And so when you look at a restorative justice lens, you're not looking at who did it and what's the crime and how do you punish the person. You look at the harm and you ask three fundamental questions. Who was harmed by what happened? And looking at the domestic violence issue, and we'll be looking at a lot in the next day and a half, obviously somebody who suffers the physical harm of domestic violence is harmed. But many people in this room know that the emotional harm, the psychological harm, the power harm, all those things are profound. And that isn't something the court system looks at, but it's the reality of the person who is struck and physically abused. But we know, and I'm going to talk about that person as a she, although it certainly can be a he, and there's elder abuse, and there are lots of examples of a difference in genders, but I'm going to use the victim as a she for the moment. She is not the only one who's harmed, and we know profoundly, and you'll hear from our people that are talking in the next day or so, the children are profoundly affected in many ways, and many of you are probably being trained in trauma-informed care, and the trauma of a child seeing the abuse in the household, even if they're not suffering from the abuse themselves, can be life-changing. And it's not just the children, it's everybody who knows and loves and cares for that survivor. It can be brothers, it can be sisters, it can be parents, it can be coworkers, and sometimes those people don't even know what's happening, but they know something's happening. And they are impacted, trying to figure out, trying to find help for that person. So we always talk the ripples in restorative justice. So you look at that survivor, there are these endless circles of harm that go out from that person. The second sort of lens we look at on the question of who is harmed is the community. There are people that may not directly know that victim, but who will be impacted by that crime. So a child who's seen a father abusing his mother may very well go to school and bully another child. That's a ripple effect. And if we don't look at it in sort of a system or a broad view, we'll never know that. But often that's coming from what's happening in the household. Or problems with the mom in the neighborhood, or the neighborhood, the abusive environment, trauma-related environment in neighborhoods, in schools, in workplaces, that all ripples out, and it affects the broader community in ways that we won't have enough time to describe. And we're also going to talk about the person who's committed the crime, because he or she has some accountability, and we're going to talk about that in restorative justice and what that means. But there are people surrounding that individual that are also impacted, and not just the spouse or partner who may be the direct victim of the offense, but friends, neighbors, colleagues, friends, people that know that perpetrator also are deeply impacted. So when you say who's impacted by domestic violence, it's a very large net. What was the harm? And I've mentioned that a little bit. And you look at all crimes. When we look at, for example, a sexual assault in a courtroom, we're saying, what kind of assault was there? Was there some vaginal touching, or was there this, was there that? You talk to a survivor of sexual assault, it's not about whether they got bruises or whether it hurt. It's the deep psychological changing of their soul, of their own identity, how they feel about other people, on their own sexuality, their own bodies. That's the harm. Again, never recognized in the court system anywhere, but deeply recognized and felt by victims. You talk to survivors of domestic violence and children, and you'll have a chance to hear some of that over the next couple days, the deep impact that happens. That's the harm we're talking about. The harm of power, the harm of not feeling safe, the trauma of all that, and the ripples that comes from. The third question in restorative justice is how do we go about repairing that harm? And I say we because there is a responsibility when it's appropriate, and it's not always appropriate, to have the offender involved in helping. And sometimes it's the offender helping the community. So, for example, one of the things we did a number of years ago with the Alma Center and Sojourner Truth is we did some circles, talking circles with offenders who were in treatment. We brought in some surrogate survivors of domestic violence and community members, and these men got to be able to tell their stories and the impact that they had on other people in the room. They can mentor people, and you will have an opportunity to hear from two of them tomorrow, and talk about what can be given back by people who have been involved in that cycle of violence. And so restorative justice is looking at ways to do that. There are two primary processes that we're probably going to be talking about, and so I just want to define them for you. One is victim-offender dialogue or victim-offender mediation. It's victim-offender facilitation, and that generally involves, that's my definition, a one-on-one with the offender or the person who's committed the act and the survivor victim or family members of a victim particularly in a homicide. And though I can tell you that we do that work in homicides and sexual assaults at Marquette, and we work with the individuals for a year on the average before we put them together. I mean, there's that much work to make sure that it's a safe conversation. And, you may ask, well, why would anybody want to have that conversation, which is what I was asking 20 years ago. Why would a victim want to sit across the table from an offender? Well, I'm just going to give you some broad answers, and then you're going to hear why somebody may want to do that in the domestic violence setting. But the one is the victim, when they don't know the offender, they want to know, they want the offender to know what you have done to me, how you've impacted me. And I can tell you that even survivors of domestic violence, they are rarely in a position to look the offender in the eyes and to tell them, this is how I feel about myself as a result of what you do to me. And often they aren't even in a position to articulate that, but they often can articulate that to others. And I can tell you that the victims, for example, in the surrogate circles we did in the domestic violence field, women were telling stories to men, these were not their abusers, how their partners convinced them that the sexually transmitted diseases that they now had were their fault, even though they hadn't had sexual relations with anyone. And they were told that no matter what they did, they were told they were ugly, they were fat, they were too thin, the food was too hot, the food was too cold, it was too late, it was too early, and how that impacted their self-esteem. And I can tell you that the men that heard those stories that were not their abusers said a number of things in those circles. One guy said, I want you guys to know that those women that are talking about the STDs are telling the truth because that's what I did to my partner. Another guy said, hearing a mother-daughter talk about sort of the intergenerational domestic violence makes me understand why maybe I shouldn't be in the house with my wife and children. And so there's in that storytelling for victims, there can be an incredible feeling of self-worth, of being listened to, and in fact, good coming out of that storytelling. And particularly in the surrogate situation, and you're going to hear from Carrie Banks a little bit today and tomorrow about the work she's been doing in surrogate victim-offender dialogues. Most of us believe that you can't easily do victim-offender dialogues in domestic violence cases for all the reasons that people know about domestic violence. You know, you can't just plop two people together and have them have a dialogue. There are power imbalances, there are all sorts of things. On the other hand, Carmen Petra and I have had this conversation for a long time. We know, and you will learn in the next few days, that the court system doesn't work in the majority of cases. It does not work. And in a large number of those cases, the survivors, for a variety of reasons, return home with their abusers. So is our choice to say, well, the court's not going to work, good luck to you, We hope that, call us if you need us. Or can we devise a process of dialogue and discussion that can happen with a facilitator in a carefully protected environment before they go home or while they're at home, so that, in fact, we can support them if they've made that decision for whatever reasons they've made that decision. So the victim-offender dialogue scenario, you're going to hear some things about. The other is, there are a variety of different processes, and some people know a lot about restorative justice. There can be family group conferencing, community conferencing, circles where people sit in a circle, often with those who've committed a crime, survivors of the crime, community members. They're all permeations of the same theme, which is really an opportunity to look at the harm. So you can look directly at a particular crime, or you can look at the crime generally, and have people describe their stories. And that's what restorative justice is about, people being able to be heard and to tell their story in a safe environment. For those of you who don't know about a circle, there are a lot of people that have been in circles. They're based on Native American traditions. They use a talking piece or a talking stick. The natives hold the circle as a very spiritual experience. Often it's an elder who is the circle keeper, or the person who holds the circle. And the person uses this talking stick, often that has a lot of spiritual symbolism, eagle feathers and other kinds of symbolism for Native Americans. Sometimes it's simply an eagle feather, which has its own spiritual value. Those of us that do other kinds of work use stones and rocks and different pieces. But the concept behind it, and we've done circles in the community, is, what I did in the domestic violence field, was asked everybody if they were willing to think for a moment and to share a personal story of either you or somebody close to you that had a story related to violence. And then I pass the talking piece to the person next to me, and they tell a story. And we have had, whether it's in the domestic violence field or other fields, offenders who have committed horrendous crimes cry and talk about watching their mother shot between the eyes when they were a child. We've had survivors talk about their prior sexual assaults and the rage that they felt and trying to deal with it. And this piece gets passed from person to person. And one of the things that happens in the circle is that people listen with their hearts, not just sort of thinking. All of us think with our heads. I always laugh. My husband will tell me that. I'll say, "What are you doing tonight?" And he said, "I just told you 30 seconds ago." And I'm as guilty as anybody else. Our brains are always on fast track, right? This prevents that, because you're not going to talk till that talking piece gets all the way over to you, and you get taken in by people's stories, and so the talking piece goes around the room, and in this time of political uproar and all the things that are going on after the election, we need these kinds of conversations. They are quiet, they are thoughtful. They are respectful of everybody in the room. People don't interrupt each other. And you cannot argue with somebody's story. You can argue with their opinion, but their story, and whether you have Israelis and Palestinians in the room, or whether you have murderers and family members of homicide victims, or whether you have domestic violence individuals who are convicted and people who are survivors. And I have to tell you, and you'll hear this, when you're dealing with people who've committed domestic violence, many of them have been also the victim of domestic violence or family violence or childhood violence. And so people have lots of stories, and they wind up sharing from their heart in this environment. And there is healing in hearing each other's stories, in knowing that that person that I may not like across the room because I don't like the way he dresses, or I don't like the way she's looking, when I suddenly hear their story, change my view, change my heart. And I'm constantly realizing the biases I have because of that experience, because I'm constantly looking at somebody and kind of sizing them up. And I'm going to share with you a story that's not related to domestic violence, but it was one of these biases. So I was in a circle on the south side. One of my friends who was working for us at the time, was facilitating the circle, he was somebody from the community, and we had a number of parolees who were gang members who were invited to come join the circle. They didn't come very voluntarily. And then we had community members and a number of other people. And one guy came in, and if you were to sort of draw in your head what a gang member looks like, this guy said it. I mean, it's just all the apparel and the walk and everything. And he sat immediately across from me, and he sat down in his chair, and he scrunched his back so his feet were way into the middle, and he crossed his arms, and I thought, okay, we're not going to get anything out of him. Maybe he'll get something out of listening. He's not going to talk, right? And he was about 3 or 4 people into it, and he took the talking piece, and he started talking, which surprised me. And he started talking about, as a child, that he'd been taken away from his mother. And he had been put with family members, and for those of us who are old enough in the room to remember, placed in Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green, for those of you who are younger and may not know what that is, that was one of these high rises in Chicago that were filled with drug dealers and crime and prostitution and shootings and drug use and were violent places. And he said, I spent 8 years there, and my mother got her act together, and they returned me to her in Milwaukee. And he said, I was returned in the fall, and already I'm still looking at this guy thinking he isn't sharing the story with us because he, doesn't look like he's a guy who's going to be telling us his life story, but he is. And he said, it was Thanksgiving time, and she put me up on the counter, and she was cooking a turkey. And he said she bent over to the oven and was down basting the turkey when all of a sudden we heard screeching tires and gunshots. And he said she jumped up and she put her arm around me and threw me to the ground. And then she fell dead in front of me with 3 bullet holes in her back. And he said I was returned to Cabrini Green. There wasn't anybody in that circle who didn't understand how he got where he got. That's a whole different thing than looking at this gang member who looks like a gang member, who acts and talks like a gang member, and who is a human underneath, but we don't get to see it. And because of this circle of trust in this restorative justice circle, he was willing to share, to trust that group enough. And we had police officers in that circle. We always had police officers in our circle and community members. And so I just wanted you to get a flavor of the kinds of things that can happen in even a group talking where we're not talking about a specific crime. I just want to tell you a police officer story, and then I'm going to wrap this up because we've got a lot of good things this afternoon. And some of you have heard me tell this story, but it's one of the most moving stories that I experienced in terms of law enforcement participating in a circle. As I said, we had Milwaukee police officers in all our circles, and we were talking about violence, and there were some moms whose sons had been murdered, and there were some moms who also had sons in prison, and there were some black ministers from churches, and we had some community people, and then there was this white officer. And he took the talking piece, and he said, a few years ago, I got called to the north side for a shooting, and he said, I was the first officer there, and he said people were screaming and yelling and just hysterical, and I kept saying, what happened, what happened? And they said, there's a shooting in that house. And so he ran up the stairs of the house, and he took his gun out of his holster, and he headed into the living room, and there was a 2-year-old child with a bullet hole right through her head, gasping. And he said, I put my gun in my holster and I picked her up. And he said, I was like in a bubble because I could hear the sirens and the screaming and all the noise. And yet I was just present to this child who took her last breath in my arms. And he said, I have thought about her, I have dreamed about her, I have talked about her. I've asked doctors and nurses, is there something I could have done? And they tell me no. And then he looked at this circle of people and he said, I want you to know that every time I get called to a shooting in the city of Milwaukee, I take her with me. I told him afterwards, I said, thank you for sharing that story. And he said, I've never talked about that publicly before. And I said, well, I know you didn't do it for this reason, but you know what? You just did more for the Milwaukee Police Department than a $100,000 ad campaign on TV. You know, there wasn't anybody that left their room that said that that officer didn't care. That's the heart of restorative justice, is people telling their stories to each other, whether it's survivor and whether it's victim, whether it's family members, whether it's children, and there are all different formats we can use for that. So the question is that we're going to be exploring is, how can we do that in domestic violence so that survivors can be safe, that their children can be safe, that the perpetrator can be safe, they can get the kind of treatment and support that they need, but yet have a dialogue that promotes healing and dialogue and understanding so that we can discontinue the violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janine. What we'd like to do now is give you a bit of a preview of Friday's presentations, and we are joined by our two keynote presenters tomorrow. And let me just say a few words about both of them. Sujatha Baliga is Vice President and Director of the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice in Oakland, California. She is seated closest to me. Her primary area of expertise is in helping juvenile justice systems replace their reliance on incarceration and other forms of punishment with restorative justice principles and practices. She is committed to reducing racial and ethnic disparities within juvenile justice systems and to exploring the use of restorative processes to prevent, address, and heal child sexual abuse and intrafamilial and intimate partner violence. Seated next to Sujatha is Carrie Banks. Carrie founded Domestic Violence Safe Dialogue in Portland, Oregon after more than 15 years of experience volunteering and working with women and children in domestic violence shelters. The mission of her work is to stop the cycle of domestic violence by facilitating safe, supervised conversations among survivors and offenders from unconnected cases, which help both parties foster transformative change inside themselves and others. So won't you give a warm Marquette Law School welcome to Sujatha and Carrie. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I think we should begin with talking about the potential of restorative justice in helping address the domestic violence problem. And I'm wondering, Carrie, maybe I'll begin with you.
Okay.
And tell the audience here why you see the possibility and why you have known the possibilities of restorative justice in terms of addressing this. What do you see there?
Well, I accidentally fell into the restorative justice group, and kind of most of my career has been an accident that I've ended up where I am. I was very bored in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and began working at a shelter and just fell in love with the work and just didn't understand it and wanted to figure it out, and I thought this has to be fixable. So changed my focus and went on to graduate school in conflict analysis and resolution. And started this program, Domestic Violence Safe Dialogue, out in Portland, Oregon, after we had moved there about 15 years ago. Again, very naively thought, oh, this is great, everybody's gonna love this. And it's going to be a cliffhanger on whether or not they did or not for tomorrow. But I went to a national conference that was being held in Portland, Oregon for a national domestic violence group, and I said, let me tell you what I'm doing. And I very quickly got kicked out of the conference, told never to leave, to never come back, and was blackballed from ever being able to attend again. And I thought, okay. Wasn't really thwarted. Have been called names, kind of every name in the book about the program that I'm doing, and I thought, yeah, but the thing is, the survivors are asking for this, so who am I to sit there and tell them that they shouldn't get what they're asking for in a safe way? So kept doing the work, kind of put my head down, and was invited to a Restorative Justice Conference, and I'd read a lot of Dr. Mark Umbright's stuff, and he was an amazing guru, obviously, in this area. and went to a Restorative Justice Conference in Maryland. It was a very, very small one, and so I had my little workshop, and 3 people showed up. We had a great time, the 3 people and I. And then we go to the keynote, and there's about 500 people in a room, and I'm in the front over to the left, and the keynote speaker starts, talking about restorative justice, and she said, "Is Dr. Carrie Banks in the room?" And I'm like, here I go again. Raise my hand, start gathering up my things, and she said, that's the future of restorative justice, domestic violence. You need to go talk to her. And I thought, I found my people. This is my tribe. These are the people that love and adore me. So, so for me, it was kind of coming in a back way and understanding that what I was doing was restorative justice. I just didn't know it. And now that I've read more and understand a whole lot more, it really is, for me, just figuring out, it's listening to the survivors and the victims and trying to help them, empower them, and help them figure out how to get the answers that they have. They have so many questions about the whys that it happened, and who better to talk to than someone else that's been where they are. And so to me, that's kind of the basis of restorative justice, is really listening to the victims of crime and helping them in a safe way figure it out.
In a couple of minutes, we'll talk about exactly how you do this, what this looks like in the way you do it, but I want to bring Sujatha into this.
Sure.
I mean, you've worked with juveniles, and you know that restorative justice can be extremely useful in terms of dealing with some of their problems. Why do you think it's also applicable to this?
I think that I wouldn't draw a line between young folks who do harm and adults who do harm in the intimate partner violence context. We've been working with teen dating violence cases as well. And so I think that it can work well in both contexts. And I think where that comes from, I think, is sort of a belief that, well, I think I'll go back and say that we have to do something, right? I mean, I'm thinking about the judge's comments just now, and the data tells us, 50% of people don't reach out to whatever systems or help that we are tracking. And of the remaining 50% who do reach out, right, and this is information that I recently heard from the head of the Office of Violence Against Women, right, who's saying that of the 50% who do reach out, only 20% say that they were made to feel more safe. So 80% of folks were failing, right? And so I think I don't want to jump the gun and say, we know restorative justice is going to work in face-to-face dialogue and participatory decision-making in intimate partner violence cases, right? Because we don't really have the data on that yet, and I tend to be a little bit of a data geek on this. What I know is that in the handful of cases that I've had the honor of facilitating, I feel that it has been astoundingly powerful, the changes that have made, and we've had zero recidivism when we're talking about intervening in ongoing intimate partner violence and teen dating violence. And so that's a really high standard, zero recidivism, I know, and I don't want to imply, because we have a very small sample size right now in the teen dating violence and other, sort of thinking about this group of teen dating violence, and then some adult sexual harm cases in ongoing relationships and other things that we've been doing. I think where I struggle to talk about this, and I'm noticing now, is that we are sort of doing this sort of off the grid in a way, right? Because we, in working with families and communities who are terrified of state intervention for a number of reasons, and legitimately so, that it is really hard to talk about how we're doing this work, right? And so that's a struggle I'm going to have today and tomorrow. And also, I know that there's a need for us to start to think about this, because those 80% of people need us, right? So they need us at least to engage in a conversation about what would it look like for us to create processes that are going to be safe in situations where people are going to stay in continued relationship, even if it is not in continued romantic relationship or cohabitation relationship. There will be continued relationship, we know this. And so we need to start thinking about what could actually work to help it. And in the handful of cases I've been involved in, I've seen really positive results.
Why does it remain controversial, or does it remain controversial, the use of restorative justice for domestic violence cases?
So
yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I just was coming from, I was telling you about this trip to Vermont that I just had, where Vermont has had sort of a long-standing interest in restorative justice. And they have these community boards, and there's some state legislation around restorative justice. And the intimate partner violence DV community back then, the Battered Women's Movement, was really opposed to restorative justice ever being used. And it's a part of the legislation that you can never use restorative justice for domestic violence. And the reasons why that happened are really smart and good, right? There was a conflation back then and today, both in the understanding of and sometimes in the practice of restorative justice with things like mediation and family counseling and court-ordered mediation, where we used to just tell people to work out their dynamic, right? We don't want to be doing that with restorative justice. And there are people who practice restorative justice that way. Those folks should never be facilitating face-to-face dialogues with restorative justice and domestic violence, right? And so there are legitimate complaints and concerns. But what was interesting was that who invited me to Vermont was not the restorative justice community, but I, like Carrie, got exited from the movement in my early 20s. Very unceremoniously shown the door. It's really painful, really, really painful exit from the movement. And I think, but I think that those, when I look back now and I see what were the concerns, I think there were legitimate concerns. I just wish that we had taken the time to talk about them in the way that didn't push particularly all the women of color out of the room. And out of positions of power and leadership. So I would love to engage in a dialogue with folks about what are the concerns as we start to build this, right? I have zero concerns about what Carrie does, like zero. I have more concerns about what I do, and everybody does, and I think we should. And so we will never build this without the wisdom of all the folks in the room, without the first and foremost wisdom of survivors who are at greatest risk both of continued harm and of state intervention, to help us think through how are we going to build this in a way that's safe and good and is going to help families live violence-free.
So if we do this, we have to do it right. And Carrie, I know you believe you've found a way to do it right. Can you describe for the people in this room exactly what you're doing?
Come back tomorrow.
Well, this is just a sneak preview,
Just a skim. So we have a survivor, and as you were saying, we obviously I use her and he because that's the majority of the people that come to us. Thank you. We have a survivor and a man who batters in the room with support people, usually it's their counselor, and then we have a male-female facilitation team. So they come together for a dialogue. They have no previous relationship, and they have no relationship after this. And so they come together, and the general gist of it is the survivor has her choice whether or not she would like to tell her story or hear the other person's story first. And so they speak for about 5 to 10 minutes and tell their story, and then the other person shares their story so that they kind of know what's in the room. And then questions come for about an hour, 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours.
And what has been the reaction of the people who have participated in this?
We have never had a bad dialogue. We've never had anyone come back and say, I regret doing that. There's so much learned in that room, and that's, when you talk about the criticism and things surrounding it, for me, it is education and intent is that's my big mantra these days, because anyone who's witnessed a dialogue is a fan. And obviously with those people in the room, you're not gonna have any other real witnesses, but all of our trained facilitators and support people who come in are all converts very, very quickly. And I think with restorative justice, we do have some hurdles in the next couple months, I think, in educating people on why we should exist. In today's society, we want things done now, and we're very immediate driven, and restorative justice is not now. It takes time. As you were saying, it usually takes about a year of prep. We talk with the survivors and we talk with the men who batter, and they have to have gone through their program. And so it's not an immediate thing that happens. You invest time. Now, the time that you invest can last for forever afterwards, and the domino effect of the people that they speak to and their children and their grandchildren. So the domino effect of what happens is obviously huge. But from the outside looking in, people that don't understand restorative justice and why it should exist, I think is something that we have to work with. And as you were describing the circles obviously have no beginning and no end. And so there's not an us and them that's in the room. It's definitely, you know who has done the violent act and the person that had a violent act done against them, but it's not, okay, you're bad, you're the good one, now let's chit-chat. It's, okay, we're all in this together, let's figure it out. And because we all are going to have different relationships, and we all, potentially either have children or might have children, and we want those children to grow up in nonviolent homes. And so educating people about what restorative justice is and the intent behind it, I think is so smart. And we were talking this morning about in the statewide elections, we have, I'm not getting into the presidential, but our state election, we had someone named Bud who was running against Kate, who's our current governor. And during a debate, he said, regrettably later, we need a lot more jobs for women, because if women had better positions, then they wouldn't be in abusive situations. And he did not understand why there was all of a sudden backlash. And so I called his office and I said, you need to come to my office. We need to have a chit chat. You, me, and two of my survivors that are on survivor impact panels, which I'll tell you what that is in a moment. And so he came, and he genuinely did not understand what he had done wrong. What he said, I said, well, CEOs of companies can be abused, and they can be emotionally abused, and you can be in an abusive household. It doesn't matter the education. It's, and so just really explain to him who, and then he said, okay, I get it. So we came to an understanding there, and then he said, okay, well, what if I made the law, or, talk to companies and say, oh, well, then if you are convicted of domestic violence, you automatically lose your job. No. And so Melanie, who's one of my survivors, she said, let me tell you, that happened. Actually, her husband was at Intel, and she said that was their policy, is if you're ever convicted of domestic violence, you lose your job. So she said, I called, and he was arrested, and then he lost his job. So we didn't have any income coming in. I have 2 children. We don't have food. We don't have this. So she said, so he was rehired later in a different section, and she said, next time something happened, I didn't call. So intent was good, outcome not good. So I do think educating around, and politicians and just everybody saying, understand that the intent might be there for positive, but you really do need to talk to people in the movement to understand the real consequences.
So who won the election?
Kate.
Yeah, I had a feeling
And
it might be
she's actually
Kate.
a domestic violence survivor.
Yeah,
and who nobody knew was a domestic violence survivor until that debate. And she exhaled, and she said, and she was our governor, because our previous governor was asked to leave early. And she took over. And so she was acting governor, and she was able to say during the debate, let me tell you, I'm kind of educated, I'm kind of the governor, and I'm a victim of domestic violence.
So let me
He
ask.
lost right then.
Yeah, it was probably over for him right
Yeah, it was
then.
over that night.
Yeah. So let me ask this question, because this seems to be a challenge, because you're still, Carrie, I think, one of the few people really doing restorative justice for domestic violence issues. How do we produce the data that you want to see when not a lot of people are doing this?
We've just started.
Fund it.
Funded, money. So we have graduate students at Portland State University who just started doing that for us, because we have a ton of anecdotal evidence over the past 15 years, but we don't have numbers, and people do love numbers. I personally don't care for numbers, but a lot of people sitting next to me like numbers. So we realized this, and so we have Portland State University has now come together, and we have, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'll have the data tomorrow. That, on the scale of 1 to 5, it's 4 to 5, participation rate, satisfaction, and things like that. So we are starting with that. But it's very hard to measure when you have, for recidivism rates, when you're in the area of domestic violence, because how do you know? And so we desperately, okay, in my dream world, if I have a couple $1 million, what I'd like to do, there was a study done by Gandalf that, is it Gandalf or Gandalf? Which one's in the Lord of the Rings? It's the other one. Gandalf. So Gandalf. I feel very bad doing that. But he did this study where he followed men going through a batterer intervention program. And those that stayed in the long program towards the end, the people that had stayed with their partners, towards the end, the physical violence had gone down to under 10% by the people who actually actively participated in the program. At the end of that section of that study, the emotional and verbal abuse had gone down to about 30%. So I would love to take that, replicate it, and say, okay, what if we add domestic violence dialogues and survivor impact panels? Would that emotional abuse section go down? Because we're kind of helping flip that empathy chip. And then, but also the side of it, what's our norm in society? Having because we're not very nice to each other these days. I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but there's been a lot of heat and divisiveness in our culture. And so 30% might be the norm. And so would we actually be getting these people below what the norm of culture is? And so it's hard to measure, but I think that would be when I get funded.
Sue Johnson, in the cases that you've been involved with, and you said it's a handful of cases, but you have seen some pretty amazing things. What does that look like? Yeah.
So I'll talk about a case that I got. There's many different ways that cases can come to an organization, and I technically don't do direct service, so I do training and technical assistance work. I used to work in a nonprofit so I'll take a step back. In 2006, I got involved in an organization called Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. RJOY is the acronym, which I think is a great acronym for an organization. And while I was there, I had a fellowship to start a restorative juvenile diversion program. And in the beginning, it was a lot of work to get the district attorney to agree to send cases. We were staying entirely in a pre-charge model, which meant that the youth who was involved in the program was not yet, we never hit the courthouse doors in a sense, right? So to get them to divert anything serious to us, and it was really understood at the beginning that there was going to be no teen dating violence, no sexual harm, none of the stuff that I actually really wanted to work on. So we started with burglaries and robberies, which were good cases to work on. It was so successful that they started to send us more and more serious cases. And it was interesting. It was actually some of the schools and other places where there was sexual assaults on school campuses or teen dating violence was coming to the schools. Different school districts in the county, they were saying, hey, can you do this with this? And so it was with continued dialogue with the district attorney that we started to get some teen dating violence and sexual harm cases. And so I'll tell you a little bit about a case that came through that process. A young man was arrested for choking his girlfriend on after school on school campus. And in my initial efforts to reach out to him, in my initial efforts to reach out to him, he was always whispering, and he was like, I can't talk now. And so we eventually found, and I said, well, I can come to your home. And he's like, don't do that. And I said, well, I really would like to get your parents' permission to participate in this program, because otherwise you're going to be charged, right? I mean, these were cases that would have otherwise been charged or going into this, pre-charge program. And he said, listen, can we just meet somewhere else? I'm like, okay, sure. And I was thinking at the time, like, I don't know if I should be meeting with kids without their parents, but something in my heart told me I should do this. I tend to break rules sometimes. And so I ended up meeting him at a Starbucks, and he tells me the whole story. First, he's like really afraid. He's like, are you sure you're not with the DA? And how did you get my case from the DA? And what's that? And I said, I have this agreement with the district attorney, and here it is in writing. It says that nothing you say can be used against you in a court of law. So we call it our reverse Miranda rule. And we say, so what's a Miranda warning? What are your warnings when you get arrested? And this young man, being an African-American young man in Oakland, had been arrested many times for just walking down the street, right? He had no priors. Interesting, all those arrests, nothing happened with him. When I got this case, he has no priors. He has previous arrests that were just arrests. So he tells me, what are they're supposed to say this, they never do. He's telling me all the stuff they're supposed to say. And I said, so this is the opposite of that. Nothing you say can be used against you in a court of law. And as soon as he felt safe about that, literally the floodgates come open and he tells me everything, right? He tells me about what was going on with his girlfriend and that he thought she was pregnant and maybe she's pregnant with somebody else's baby, but even if it was somebody else's baby because she's been cheating on him, but then she was on drugs and he knew that she was on LSD that day and he just got so mad at her because if it was his baby or somebody else's baby, you shouldn't be doing that because his little brother actually is all messed up because his mother did all these drugs when she was in the story is going on and on and on. And I said, I'd really like to get your parents involved in this conversation. And he said, well, you can try, but I think it's a really bad idea. And in several phone calls with both his mother and his father, they didn't want him to participate because they didn't want him to take any responsibility for this. And as I am talking to them on the phone, because they refused to meet with me in person, it becomes clear that there's domestic violence in their relationship. And then I gently ask him about this and start to think. And he's like, well, I know you're a mandated reporter, so I don't know. And he knew about mandated reporters. Mm-hmm. This kid knew about mandated reporters at 16. And he says, so I'm not going to tell you anything. And I said, well, I don't know, but you're just witnessing violence in the home, but maybe, And so now I'm doing the game that I do, which is the opposite of what I like to do, which is to say, tell me everything, especially for people living through stuff, right? But I can't do that because I am a mandated reporter, right? And so we start to just come up with the plan about how he's going to move out and live with his brother, and that's going to be a part of the plan to participate in this program. Because our plan has 4 parts. You do right by your parents, your victim, your community, and yourself. Sometimes we have to get rid of that doing right by your parents part, maybe, when the kid actually needs to go somewhere else, but by his own choice, not because somebody came and took him away, right? And so what does it look like for us to craft that together, right? And so he's totally taking responsibility. At one point he breaks down and he's weeping and he's saying, help me not be like my father, right? And he's like, I'm really mad at my brother for leaving me with that. And he's got a great marriage and he's got a great wife and they go to a great church. And so then it's about, well, it's in another county, and can I get the DA to allow me to let this kid get transferred, et cetera, et cetera. So we do a lot of prep, and even in the prep, right, as much as he's like, help me not be like my dad, he also carries a lot of really messed up thinking about girls and what they aren't allowed to do. And so we got to do a lot of work on that front. But actually, this all moved pretty quickly. In about 6 to 8 weeks, we were ready to go to conference. And so the conference was really powerful, in part because we brought in someone from a domestic violence shelter to be in dialogue with us and with him. And to help me, even though I'd worked in shelters for years before I got exited from the movement. And so I feel really confident about my capacity to see whether or not I'm being gamed and whatnot. But it was really good to have somebody from a local shelter come into the conversation. So during this conversation, again, the young man breaks down, weeping, saying, help me not be like my parents, right? And ends up in deep relationship with the woman at the shelter and starts, the part of the plan to do doing right by the community was him volunteering at that shelter, right? He and his girlfriend decided to break up and that she was ending up moving out of town, but they really, watching her tell him what the impact of all of that was on her, really I saw the light bulbs go off in his eyes. I see that over and over again, right? In the sexual harm cases, when you've got this 15-year-old who's been sort of feeling very shy until that moment where she busts out and starts yelling at the young man, and we don't police the volume with which people speak, right? About what no means no means is an incredibly beautiful thing to see, right? So through the process, we come up with a plan to repair the harm, and I really just get to see, and then we support the young person who's done the harm to complete that plan, right? What did you need to get it all done in this plan? And it's not an easy plan. If anything, sometimes I have defense attorneys who have problems with it because we don't, it doesn't line up with some statutory thing about how much the sentence is going to be, right? There is no sentence. It's what does everybody in the room think needs to happen through consensus to move forward in a good way. And a part of that is safety planning. It has to be safety planning, right? If this is going to be an ongoing relationship, or it isn't, right? We have to keep our eyes open about the potential for stalking, et cetera, et cetera. So, for me, why I do this, I'm a survivor, and when I am in the space, I get to see real healing and real feeling of the potential for safety moving forward, because we really are unearthing everything. In my previous life, I was a defense attorney, and I know that what a part of my job was to minimize and shrink sort of the exposure that my client was going to have to a system that I found equally oppressive, right, to the violence that my clients may have caused. And so that, as a survivor, is the last thing in the world that we want. We want all the facts to come out. We want somebody to take full responsibility for what they've done. And to me, when restorative justice is done well, we are really creating the opportunity for that.
Carrie, where do the people who participate in your program come from? How do they end up expressing an interest in taking part in this?
We work with, there's Domestic Violence Resource Center, Gateway, there's a lot of different local survivor service groups, and then the Batterer Interventions Program. And I was saying earlier, I have to walk this really fine line in between, because the shelters and the domestic violence survivor groups really hate the Batterer Intervention programs, and the Batterer Intervention programs really don't like the shelter, at least where I am in Hillsboro, Oregon, because, and there's a part of me that understands, because when I did shelter work, you build up this monster on the other side, and so you're sitting there thinking, okay, these people are not redeemable. I mean, you're sitting there cleaning up the mess that they've done, in shelter work and day in and day out, and doing the crisis work, and I did restraining orders and all this, and you do start to build up a resentment, and it's like, oh, you're helping them, really? Like, they can be rehabilitated? Are you kidding me? So I understand going into, why it is, and then the same thing for the Batterer Intervention groups, they see change, and they see the men who batter and women who batter change their lives. And so for them, they're sitting there saying, oh yeah, but the survivor groups don't believe in us. They think what we're doing is hoo-ha, and so we're not gonna get, anywhere. And so I kind of, for the past 15 years, have just walked this line. I refuse to call myself a survivor program. I refuse to call myself an offender program, because we're kind of the go-between between the two, and we've gotten some of the groups actually talking, which has been very exciting. So we have these council now in Hillsborough County, I'm sorry, in Washington County, and then also in Multnomah County, where they do actually come together, an intervention program. And so, because and we have the police force come in, and we're trying to do this whole talking dialogue thing that we profess to love. So trying to get everyone in the room to say, okay, we can't have an us and them again. We have to work on this together.
Tell me about the people who participate when they have finished taking part in this program. What do they say about it?
From the participants?
Yes.
The quotes are amazing, and I've got a bunch of them to share tomorrow. But it's just that, it's just finding out the answers, and that's such a gift. And I'm very honored to be able to witness so many gifts being given, because these people don't have to be honest with each other, and they are. But and that's, if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're like, gosh, I just wish I could ask so and so, but I can't. Well, this is a way that they actually can. And we also, so part B of our program is doing survivor impact panels, where we have 3 survivors talking to a room of men and women going through a batterer intervention program. It's after week 26 of their program, and they have to be referred by their counselor, so we don't have anyone come in and derail the whole process. So it's a lot like a DUI panel, where you can actually hear. I like stories, I like storytelling, and we all learn different ways. And so for me, if I'm sitting in a class, all through school, and here's statistics, and here's why this works, and here's the rule of this, and all of that, I kind of get it. But if someone were actually telling me their story, then I really get it. And so that's the theory behind that part as well. And you can see it's kind of a fascinating nonverbal study if you want to geek out on it. So you can sit in the back of the room. We have about 30 individuals sitting in the front of the room, and then the 3 panelists. And the men and women who come in don't want to be there, and it's required by 3 of the counties now, and Governor Brown, hopefully we're going to be required in more counties, which means we'll actually be funded. But you see, everybody's very sitting up straight, and it's fascinating, because anyone of the community who's come has noticed the same thing. They're sitting there thinking, okay, these women are going to scream at me and tell me how horrible I was to my partner, and blah, 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 blah. Well, they just tell their story, and they're just saying, and here's, what my dad called me growing up. My dad used to call me a whore. So when my husband called me a whore, it didn't really shock me, because I was kind of prepped for it. And then they start talking, and they don't talk a lot about the physical abuse, because as you were saying, the bruises heal, but the emotional scars are there, and they just, that's what they talk most about, and the impact on their children. And you can just, from the back of the room, see people just relax and just leaning forward. And very few people are not changed when they walk out of that room, whether you've been a victim of violence or not. I grew up in a nonviolent household, but every time I walk out of there, exhale in my car and just think, wow. I mean, the bravery of the people telling the story, the bravery of the people sitting there in the room witnessing it and hearing it and making the choice to change their behavior, it's huge.
I've heard you describe the people who participated. You said they're strong, because that's been one of the criticisms, is that, sometimes we could revictimize on people. And you said these are strong people to begin with. We should never forget
the
that.
survivors?
Yes.
Yeah. They get up, they get beat, and they go to work, and they take care of their children, and they come home, and they've survived. Yeah, they're very strong. They're not what Hollywood puts up there as the meek, woman, right? I mean, no. So, no, they're extremely strong, stronger than I am on a lot of days, and to the point where once they are out of some of their relationships, a couple of the women that I work with, two of our panelists, Rochelle and Melanie, have started their own nonprofit. And so we give them a space because they saw a need of, there's not really a support group, not a group counseling, but they said we need a support group for women to be able to come and say, okay, where can I get childcare because I've got to go back and find a job now? Where can I do this? So it's just kind of this support group place. And then one of them was a severe victim of financial abuse, horrible, horrible financial abuse, as in pouring the water, in the milk to feed her children, and her husband's eating at Ruth Chris Steakhouse, kind of the hiding of the money. And so she said, she's a gardener, and so she's gotten all these amazing donations, and she takes survivors of domestic violence and teaches them how to garden. Because she said, if you ever have a little plot of land, you and your family will never be hungry. So she teaches them how in a 2x4, even if they don't have a yard of their own, they can put this on a balcony or somewhere in their apartment and grow food for their family. Because she said, if I didn't know how to garden, my children and I would have starved. And, and also putting your hand in the dirt and all the healing properties of that. So they've got a lot of the local Home Depots and places have donated all these planter boxes so that these women can feed their families. I mean, it's beautiful and it's incredible and it's brilliant. And they marched down in Salem and talked to their representatives. And and that's the other side of it, is it's not an us and them, it's everywhere around us. I was trying to get our panels in a big sports team in Portland. And I walked in and I said, we should do this as a preventative measure because, just to hear the effects and the panels. And they said, okay, well, we might be able to do this for the athletes, but we don't really need to do it for our corporate office. I said, well, yeah, you do. You should be doing this because everybody benefits who walks in that room. She said, well, we don't really have domestic violence here in our office. And luckily, I didn't have to be the big mouth. The woman sitting next to her, she said, do you remember Rebecca that was our receptionist out there? She said, yeah. She said, do you know why she left last year? No, she's in hiding. And she said, oh, it's in our office. I'm like, yeah, it's in your office. It's here. Just because you don't know about it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And these women put on a brave face and come to work every day, and they do their job, and they're amazing. And so, yeah.
So as we look toward the future, and I'd like you each to weigh in on this, Carrie, you've talked about funding on a couple of occasions, but is this, the greater use of restorative justice in addressing domestic violence, is this something that governments should be at least taking a look at and saying, we're going to do a pilot program in this community. We're going to see, no, you don't think that's a proper role for government, or you don't think they're going to do that?
I don't trust them.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, this is my fourth child, for sure, and I have been in too many meetings. I don't mind it being mandated by the counties, and I like them using their victim assistance funds to help foot the bill and things like that. That involvement I appreciate, but every time that I've started to because there was a big part of me that's like, sure, I should go and talk to my senator and get everything funded, and let's go through that. They want to change it. They want to streamline it. And they're going to morph it into something that's not accessible for everyone. And that's not what we do. So I make no money. I don't take a salary. I'm very privileged to be able to say that. We fundraise. We hold like 2 fundraisers a year that pays for my program director and our office, and the little mailings that we do and things like that. Because I don't want intervention from government. I don't trust.
I'm with her. So here's the thing. here's the thing. I take a salary, actually.
I want to. I'm not taking a stand that I won't.
So here's my struggle with it, right? So when I think about the 80% of folks that aren't asking for help, I see that number going up. And speaking personally, right, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, where I endured an unbelievable amount of harm in my home because I preferred that to the harms that I perceived would occur if I sought help. I didn't want my father locked up. I didn't want my mother and sister deported. I didn't want to be taken away and put in the house. Where the other kids who were put from CPS were with that pastor who ended up getting some of those girls pregnant, right? And then I, in high school, drove them across county lines state lines, so that they could get an abortion. And even though I myself was a very devout religious person, right? And I didn't believe in that back then, and I still, this was the mess of state intervention, right? The very systems designed to protect me were the ones that ensured my continued suffering. And I fear that. Then I also fear all the stuff that you said, the streamlining, how are we going to get it done on the court calendar, restorative justice moves like water. And it happens in ways that sometimes are slow, and they call upon our ancient wisdom, and they call upon community and family to support folks, to change things that are about family and community, not about the state, right? So to my mind, the models that I look to are the ways in which the state can partner with people that supports community, nonprofit, trusted organizations on the ground who get this stuff right to start to build this stuff, right? That's the role of the state, not to facilitate these dialogues. We've actually have international data that shows that when the state is actually the facilitator of processes, that recidivism rates go up, which does not go that direction, right? And so for me, I am really struggling with being here today because I really have to, I'm rewriting my talk tonight because it's a very different talk. I was planning to go to meetings at the Office of Violence Against Women over the next 2 months to be thinking about how we're moving forward with the reauthorization of VAWA. And because the things in the Violence Against Women Act and the way in which we embedded it in the crime bill that created the mess that we have today in the domestic violence movement, right? And I was a part of that. I used to help the NYPD institutionalize its mandatory arrest policies. And then being the data geek that I am, even back in my early 20s, I was like, so how's that mandatory arrest thing working out? And we started to keep track of who we were arresting, and the greatest increase in arrests was of African American women. Okay, let's think about that, right? Police officers show up, they're gonna arrest somebody, and she's the one who scratched him while he was choking her, but the bruises aren't showing up on her neck, right? So then who gets taken away? She does. And so I was a part of that, right? And when I started to ask questions, guess who just lost her job at NYPD, right? So I'm usually not this emotional about this, but I'm really at a loss today about what we're gonna do moving forward. And I need all of us to think about how we're going to do this right. And for me, as much as I've been the restorative justice movement, so I get constantly criticized by my transformative justice sisters and brothers about being quote unquote, in bed with the state. And I have been embedded with the state, and I think that there are times when that is incredibly beneficial. And I think that there are ways in which we need to figure out how to work with police, how to work with prosecutors, et cetera. And that there are people who, we were talking about this in the hallway this morning, about some people are gonna need to call 911. So I had dreams over the next 4 years that we're moving in a direction where we could do what's happening in Eugene, Oregon. They have this thing where you call 911, and there's one of two options. You can ask for the police, or you can ask for this thing called Cahoots. And Cahoots is this like mental health van that shows up and de-escalates mental health situations. And the police love it because they're not skilled to figure out what to do, right? We give them a hammer and we ask them to do things that they don't have the skills. Well, what do we know else that police aren't skilled to do, right? It's not unrelated to the fact that the #1 cause of police lethality in this country is intervening in domestic violence situations. That's the thin blue line, y'all, right? And so we need to be thinking about what would happen if we called 911 and you could ask for restorative justice, and you could ask for domestic violence intervention, interveners, or you could ask for Cahoots mental health help. You could ask for the police, because some stranger is, got a gun to your head at a car, right? That road rage situation, which I think is a pretty good use of the police, right? And I think, so that's what I would have said 2 days ago.
I'm going to take some questions from the audience. Does that sound good to,
Yes.
to the two of you? Great. If you are seated here in the seating bowl, please press down on the rim, not on the ball, but just keep your finger down on that rim around the ball, and we'll be able to hear your questions. If you are in the back of the room, I think we'll have a microphone here, but if we don't, you can stand up and ask your question in a nice, loud voice. And please, if you can keep the questions fairly brief, we'll get to as many as possible. So raise your hand if you have a question for our guest today. Way in the back, and Steve will bring the microphone. So wait for Steve, and we'll take your question. Thank you.
Thank you. This is so enlightening. How in the world do you pull out the factor of addiction?
Mm-hmm. You want to take that? You want me to? So when dealing with domestic violence, see, and here's where I come at. Are you talking about the survivors or the offenders? And when one of my survivors talk about the perfect victim, because so many of the shelters won't take a survivor if she has drug or alcohol issues. Well, if my husband's beating up on me, guess what I'm going to do? I might have some wine or drugs and alcohol. And so there is this whole notion of the perfect victim. And so, so parceling that out, and then of course you have the men and women who batter, and we just call alcohol liquid courage because that's such an excuse. The drugs and alcohol might exacerbate it, but it's not the cause of domestic violence. Matt Johnston, my program director, uses this analogy, and I don't, even though I'm about to say it out loud, but he says, when you're drunk, do you ever sleep with your sister? There are certain lines that you don't cross no matter how much you've had to drink. That would be one, and hitting your spouse should be another, because there's not a solid black line of what is abusive behavior. And so with our survivor impact panels, we are talking to universities about going in and doing prevention in fraternities and sororities, because they do have a solid black line of, you're not going to kill someone if you're drinking. Well, you shouldn't hit your girlfriend either, or your boyfriend, you shouldn't kick him in the shins. That's all wrong, that's all abuse. And so prevention and education, saying, okay, here's where we stand. And one university, I was emailing back and forth, and she wrote back, she said, well, I just have too many domestic violence cases to talk to you about prevention. So I emailed her back and said, read your email again and call me. So we're actually in the other big university in Oregon, Oregon State. We're about to start our survivor impact panels in December. We're starting with the football team, then we're going to move on to fraternities, sororities, and then the world. So, yeah.
I would just add briefly to that. So the inspiration for everything I do in restorative justice around intimate partner and sexualized violence comes from a community in Canada. It's a Ojibwe community in Manitoba called Hollow Water. And I would strongly advise everybody to watch this very difficult 1-hour film. It's free. It's put out by the Canadian Film Review Board. Hollow Water. And so in Hollow Water, Manitoba, there was a small community of Ojibwe folk who had a serious problem with alcoholism, severe alcohol problem. And a group of women got together to talk about sort of what this poison was doing in their community, including domestic violence, sexual harm. All of it was sort of started to come out through conversations that actually started around talking about the alcoholism in their community. And what they learned through that was that 80% of the children in their community were being sexually abused. And 45% of the grown-ups in that community were self-reporting sexually abusing kids in their community. That's a lot of folks. And so what then the state did was like, as they started to figure out what was going on, they're like, okay, well, we're gonna take those people away. But that was like 45% of the people. And the response was, hello, you taking people away is how this thing started in the first place. So where did that harm come from? It came from the boarding school crisis, where every single child in that community 1 generation earlier had been taken to boarding schools, where they were uniformly sexually abused and physically abused, all of them, which is another thing that came out from these conversations about addiction, right? And so they all were like, whoa, hold up. The crown took us away, and then they put us back, and then this is what followed, right? And so you're not gonna take us away again because the last time you took us away, that's what caused this. And so the Canadian government, being far wiser than us, because they do things like have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about taking away people, the same thing we did here, actually, same thing we did here. They were like, all right, we'll hold off. What are you guys gonna do? And they said, well, we don't remember exactly, but we had our own medicine for this. And our neighboring nation, the Cree Nation, has agreed to come back and teach us how to use our own medicine to heal. And so through creating this amazing circle process, they deeply engaged in the process of unearthing the intrafamilial and sexual harm that was happening in their communities. And they only had 2 reported cases during this process of people reoffending. 2. Amazing, after that level of abuse coming down to this. And in the process, needed to look, yes, at addiction, needed to look at historical harms, needed to look at all of it, and come up with safety plans for the kids, right? And kids being separated in ways that were useful for the kids. Sometimes the kids were taken out, sometimes the person who harmed was taken out, but everyone stayed in community around healing this and realizing that both there was individual accountability and there was historical harm. That was still playing itself out. Transgenerational trauma is at the root of all of this, and to my mind, something that we can't solve this unless we have the courage to look at those really, really big, dark holes. We have to look in there with the spotlight of love.
Let's take another question. Please raise your hand. We'll go here and then we'll go there.
You've sort of touched on it, talking with different cultures. Perhaps my experience in the military was with Asians who think quite a bit differently than we do, whites, blacks in this country. How do you basically adjust to the cultures that you're dealing with? Or do you think that's not really a problem?
I don't know. So for me, so I keep circle with a group of South Asian survivors of child sexual abuse, and it is, and we're talking about expanding it to all Asians, and then expanding it to people of color, and we always talk about that, but then we feel like there might be something lost if we move beyond just South Asians. And it's not that we think about, because I've been in lots of survivor groups where it's everybody, and I don't find that we talk about it, or that the experience of harm is that different. Or the experience of, it's just that we talk about it differently when we're alone. And so there is some incredible value to people owning their own spaces where, I have literally been in community with African-American friends who are like, yeah, that happens a lot in your culture, doesn't it? And I'm like, really no, don't say that, because you're like, we're all people of color. We shouldn't say that stuff about each other, right? And I have literally seen South Asians say the same thing about black people. I'm like, don't do that, don't, right? But there's a way in which when we just close the door and get to be amongst our own people, we get to kind of say everything without fear of people judging us on the basis because of our ethnicity, our race, et cetera. So that is the one primary reason that I feel like there's some value, because I don't know that I experienced the sexual abuse and sort of terror that I grew up with differently than a white kid or anything else. More so, I felt that people literally, I had a high school teacher say to me after my father passed away, yeah, I thought that was going on in your home, but it's kind of a part of your culture, right? Or had said, and she was this liberal woman, like in this very, very red part of rural Pennsylvania, where she said, I didn't want to do anything because I was just worried that like the racism of this town was just going to make it worse for your family if we unearthed this, right? And there was some wisdom in that, right? I mean, she's kind of right a little bit about that part. But so to me, it's less about differences in cultural ways of dealing with things. Like everybody carries secrecy and shame around sexual harm. It's not like, ain't nobody in any community wants to sit up here and say, so I was sexually abused by my father. Like everybody's face gets hot when they say that. Everybody's mortified. Doesn't matter if you're a rich white person or poor. It's the additional structural harms that occur. And if I say that, what are the immigration consequences, right? If I say that, how's it going to get people to double down on their idea that Indian men are really lechy and slimy, right? When those are my uncles and my cousins that you're also talking about, right? So to that end, I don't want people to double down on their stereotypes. And that's why I want to be with my own folks to sort this stuff out. And it's ours to solve, not for white folks to figure out how to fix me. That's another big part of it. Because every time that's happened, somebody's come up with really the wrong answer. So, and I feel really buoyed right now by the fact that as I'm being gently welcomed back into the domestic violence space, right? It's funny when I'm like literally being invited by the same coalitions that were like, bye. There are amazing, amazing white women in this work who are saying I was a gatekeeper.
Thank you.
And I was afraid. I was a gatekeeper, and I kicked you out because I didn't like what you were saying, and it was causing you to hold up a mirror to me wanting to control this for you, and I pathologized you, and et cetera, et cetera. And so that's another piece, I think, of the big mess that is race in relationship to race, ethnicity, immigrant status, all of it, all the oppressions, all of them, transphobia, all of it, in relationship to the work that we need to do moving forward in healing intimate partner violence, sexual harm.
And so I will say, I am white. I know my tan from Portland, Oregon doesn't really show it. And most of Portland, Oregon is. It's, I think, 89% Caucasian. So we have not had a lot of dialogues of people of color. We're just saying, our first Spanish-speaking dialogue was only 2 months ago. One of the reasons for this is because, again, the intent was lovely, but in their infinite wisdom, a law was passed that if you are, if someone calls 911 and you're arrested and if you're here illegally, you're immediately deported within 48 hours. Okay. Consequent of that is that Latino women, Hispanic women were not calling for help because they were afraid that then their partner would be deported and there goes their income, there goes the father to their children, and plus they knew where he was before, and now he's crossed the border back into Mexico. We have a very large migrant population, so it's only $10,000 to get across the border, if anybody wants to know, at least at this point in time. I don't know with this wonderful wall. It could be a tunnel, I don't know. But it's $10,000 currently to cross the border, and they don't know when he's going to get that. So he's down in Mexico with his family and friends. He raises the money. They don't know when he's going to come back, knock on the door, and say, honey, I'm home, and I'm ticked. So they're in much worse condition than they were before they ever called. And so the Spanish-speaking domestic violence program saw a dramatic drop in people asking for help. Again, unintended consequence because the lawmakers were like, why aren't you all happy with this? We're like, you need to talk to us before you do things like this. So we don't have a lot of culture, but it's the same, we don't have a lot of same sex because there's just not the resources. There's not a lot of resource centers that will refer same-sex couples just because there's not a lot of resources for same-sex couples. And the police come in and there's two men, they have no idea who's the the perpetrator and who's the victim in that case sometimes, and they arrest both people and say, we'll just sort it out later. Well, then somebody's going into a secondary aggressor group, even though they really weren't the secondary aggressor. They maybe fought back, or so it gets a little convoluted when you have other things. But so culturally, we've had probably someone from many, many, many different cultures be involved in dialogues, and they're all the same. It's all the same questions of, is there something I could have done? Why did he do this to me? Well, that crosses pretty much every culture.
Let me take your question.
I was just wondering, with all the talk about how the judicial system and laws place so many deterrents for women to call and ask for help, until this process of restorative justice really hits every community and becomes our way of doing things, how do you see a way to motivate women to continue reaching out?
So first, I want to say, I don't think restorative justice is a panacea, and that there's lots of different ways of dealing. So I would really lift up Mimi Kim's work, who does this thing she calls creative interventions, and look that up. And then there's restorative justice is it's a voluntary thing, right? Always for survivors, not always for the folks who do harm, because I don't believe that we don't have community norms that are voluntary, right? So people who say restorative justice always has to be voluntary, I say always and only for the person who's been harmed, right? Always. And in the meanwhile, I'm wondering what it is for us and why I really look to Mimi's work and the work of transformative justice generally as sort of the safety net around the restorative processes that I want to engage in. I think of it as what does it mean for people to feel safe to reach out for help, period? If you can't call the police, if you literally cannot call the police because you don't know if there's going to be dual arrests and you're going to be deported, or you already had 2 CPS interventions and you're afraid they're going to take your kids away, and whatever it is, whatever reason you cannot call for help, then, or shelters have turned you away because you have a 14-year-old son, seriously, right? I mean, all this craziness, right? Until we fix all that, right, I really feel like we need to be asking ourselves, what would we do if somebody called me and said, I need help? And this is something that's happened in my community. Rich, doctors, people with, all that, right? CEOs of things, whatever. This happens to all of us, right? And I mean, and so what do we do when stuff's not okay, right? And what does it look for us to do? So what I find amusing about the whole conservative interest in my work prior to the last 2 days, there's a real interest in ending mass incarceration from Newt Gingrich, right? He's a big proponent of ending, and he names it as a racialized mass incarceration problem. And what's interesting about that is that they sort of see it as the apex of big government gone bad and something. And there's also a bit of let people mind their own business, right? And the terrors that we have, that we spent all these years as feminists trying to deprivatize the harms that women in particular experience, but all of us experience, but women do at a higher rate often. And so I was getting excited, really, like somebody from the Koch brothers reached out to us, right? I was like, really? Wow, okay. I didn't end up working with them at all on anything, actually. But it was interesting to me, right, that the thing is, no, this is something that families and communities should be sorting out. This isn't the job of big government. And to some degree, given the way big government has gone, right, even with the policies of Bill Clinton, et cetera, right, this stuff hurt us. And so, all right, fine. I'm going hyper-local for the next 4 years. And that's how we're going to build it. And what does that look like? What does it look like for families and communities to, we did a lot of good stuff, y'all. We brought the stuff out of the closet. I am sitting here saying this stuff happened in my home, right? This is not something, I was literally told in law school to never talk about this because there's no way I could get a job, that I would continue to be pathologized. And that was true in the DV movement. People were pathologizing me and telling me I was too broken as a survivor to do this work, right? We are not there anymore. Y'all inviting me to sit here and talk, right? So that's good. And now the question is, what do we do? Because we're going to have to do it underground. We're going to have to do it in the small. Hey, we want big government out of our business? Fine. This big government we need to keep out of our business. And so what does it look like for us to heal this? I think my heart is particularly broken for those really awesome prosecutors and cops that wouldn't want to necessarily do the wrong thing, right? To start a chain of events that could be so dangerous for folks. And I worry for them about sort of what's going to sit on their conscience if they do trigger processes that end up leading to mass deportations of folks who are suffering the consequences of structural harm and playing that out in their families. But yeah, I'm really excited about what it is that we can do now. Now we're going to have to double down on that.
Carrie, you want to take about a minute? And we'll...
Sure. And I would say shame is a huge thing that we have to get past and we have to share. And, 1 in 5 have been a victim of sexual assault. 1 in 5. And we don't talk about it. And we need to. And I was telling a project I'm doing, carriebanks.com, I'm taking people's stories and I'm going to make it into a book because I think sharing our stories and just normalizing it and saying, it does happen in this office. It does happen in this school. It's happened to me. It's happened to you. It's happened to her. It's happened, on different levels, and just getting it out there and just taking the shame away is for me, one of the biggest things, and talking about it as it's not locker room stuff. It's not. And if it is, change your locker rooms. And it really is just normalizing it to say, gosh, this happened to me, and I lived through it, and let me tell you about it so that it doesn't happen to you, and talking to our kids about it. We had Denise Brown come and do a fundraiser for us. She's the sister of Nicole Brown Simpson, and she talked about, we had everything. She said we talked about sex at our, growing up. She said we never mentioned the word domestic violence, never. And so she said one of the big things that she tells parents right now is say where you were tonight, start the conversation with your kids and say, by the way, here's what domestic violence looks like. And it's not just physical. Here's if your boyfriend's, controlling over you. Here's what that looks like, and here's what you need to do about it. To just open up that whole line of communication and just talk and talk and talk. My poor children are talked to death. But, just so really and truly just taking the shame out of it and just saying, here's what it looks like. Yeah.
We're going to pause right there, and just a word about what we're going to do. We're not going to take a break because it's late afternoon, and I know you all have things you need to do too tonight. So what we're going to do is we're just going to switch out our panelists, and then we're going to go on right with the next discussion. But before we do that, let's please give another round of applause to Sujatha Baliga and Carrie Banks. Thanks to you both. And to the next panelists, come on down. We'll get them seated here. Okay, I think I'll just begin again, and we'll do brief introductions here. This is a little different discussion. We want to get a sense of the magnitude of the domestic violence problem in our community here in Milwaukee. And joining us to have that discussion and also to talk about restorative justice's potential role in this issue are 3 women. First of all, seated closest to me is Terry Strodoff, the founder and president of the Alma Center. Good to have you here. Seated next to Terry is Carmen Petrie, the executive director of Sojourner Family Peace Center. And seated next to Carmen is Patty Seeger, the executive director of End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin. Again, a warm welcome to them from all of us here at Marquette Law School. So I did want to begin by talking about what we're dealing with, what you see in your work today, and talk about the scope of the problem that you see in Milwaukee today. Anybody can begin. Each of you maybe just take a couple of minutes and tell us what you're seeing out there.
Well, I was sitting here and I was thinking, why did I say yes to Janine about this conversation? Because we've been in conversation about 10, 12, maybe more years about needing to have this conversation. And I was also thinking, this is a very, very, very complicated issue, and more than one thing is always true at a time. At Sojourner, we see close to 10,000 women a year, and we have for the last 10 years or so. The statistics that were given are very true. For the 10,000 we see, we know that a good majority are not coming to us. We have consistently about 9,500 911 calls to the Milwaukee Police Department. About 6,000 cases get charged in the district attorney's office, and about half of those end up in an adjudication where someone gets sentenced to a treatment program. So unlike the community in Portland, a lot of the batterers treatment programs, all of them, in fact, until the Alma Center came around, came out of our traditional domestic violence program. So we've had a relationship. So that's sort of the state of the state. And when mandatory arrest was passed, the law in 1989, we had close to 18,000 calls a year. And many of my colleagues would say over the years, don't you think it's a great thing that our numbers are going down? And we would say, no, that just for us means that more women of color in particular are not calling the system. So still high, we're at about 10,000. We have about 70,000 contacts at Sojourner with the clients we serve each year.
Patty, I'll have you, and then we'll go down to Terry.
Sure. So I could represent, rather than Milwaukee, I'm the head of the statewide coalition against domestic violence, and so I'll represent a little bit of the statewide conversation. So, you know, there's these statistics, and they represent numbers that represent real lives. And so what we know is that in Wisconsin, there are probably more than 100,000 victims of domestic violence in any given year. What we know is that domestic violence programs across the state serve more than 40,000 women, children, and men annually. And that number's been fairly consistent. It stays consistent because when we're talking about programs that, particularly that offer shelter, it's a finite space. You can only have so many people in and so many people out. And in fact, shelter stays because the economy has been pretty crummy. It's on the rebound now, but it's been bad for quite a while. Shelter stays have increased and people are staying longer, so it's meant fewer people in and out. But I want to mirror what Carmen is saying. Mandatory arrest was implemented April 1st of 1989, and the first full year that we had data was 1990. And there were more than 40,000 arrests in that year. If you were to look at that report now, I think it was something like 43,000. If you were to look at the most recent report, it's like 28,000. And so, and since the passage of the Federal Violence Against Women Act, there's been a lot of research that's shown the number of arrests have gone down. I really want to mirror what Sujatha has been saying, that what we know about the interventions that we have created, specifically mandatory arrest, is that it has been a failure for many, that it has led to fewer and fewer victims calling because they now know in this first couple of years, they didn't really know that it was going to result in an arrest. They called police because they wanted immediate intervention. Sometimes the situations are very serious and the police need to do something, obviously very immediate. Sometimes somebody's seriously wounded, shot, killed. Those are some interventions, but for run-of-the-mill, I hate to say this, it sounds horrible, but for disorderly conducts and pushing, shoving, slapping, suddenly people are getting arrested and put in jail, and in jail long enough to potentially lose their jobs. And suddenly families are experiencing more hardship from that arrest than they are experiencing help. This is not the fault of the police or the prosecutors or the judges. It is a collective problem where we made a decision very long ago to pursue a course of action. The domestic violence movement many years ago decided to pursue a course of action that relied primarily on the criminal justice system for intervention. If you talk to victims, if we talk to victims then and if we talk to victims now, what they say they most need from us is economic. They need housing. They need access to childcare. They need living wage jobs. That's the stuff. So, you know, this is where we are now. We've invested deeply in a system that hasn't worked particularly well for many victims and works for some. I don't want to ever say that it's like a flat out it doesn't work, but you know, that's sort of the state of where we are in Wisconsin. We're one of 24 states that passed mandatory arrest. We were the 14th state, and after the 24th the trend stopped pretty abruptly.
I'm going to come back to this mandatory arrest issue in a moment, but I want to bring Terry in here to give us your sense of what you're seeing in our community in terms of domestic violence.
Well, I think that we have created a picture of domestic violence and a picture of of victims that is about a victim cowering in the corner, is about a person, a monster, towering over her, and that's somebody who's going to stop at nothing, and they're going to stalk, and they're going to attack and go after this person and stop at nothing. And when we create that picture, I think it means that we think of that as domestic violence and we don't think of the whole scope of what happens. So it's interesting because we provide an orientation class for men who are coming to our program. We work with men who've had a history of violence in the family. And throughout the years, we've had people sit in who have been law students, who have been volunteers for our agency, who've been interested community members, and we do a whole thing where we are showing a house and the many different ways that people can harm and cause pain to each other in the house. And inevitably, every person who's in the orientation is like, oh, I didn't really think about that as domestic violence. I didn't really think about my Uncle Joe or myself the way that I act in relationship. And I think that we create this idea of victim and perpetrator that is built upon these images of who we think they are, and it doesn't allow us to understand the scope of what is going on, the scope of pain and harm that goes on in relationships. Because I really think that all of us are in this. All of us we don't have a lot of education for children growing up about how to be nurturing, how to be respectful, how to actually help somebody grow and thrive and have an intimate relationship that helps people grow to their greatest potential. So I think that it is really a huge problem. And then within that, there are people who get swept up into the criminal justice system, and that's what we think of as the problem. And we identify that as domestic violence, but it really is a way that we interact with each other, many, many people in relationship. And so when you think about it that way, and you think like if yourself was you're like, wow, I'm having challenges in my relationship, I'm raising my voice, or I'm calling somebody out of their name, or I'm doing something that is really harming the person that I'm with, and you would never think about for yourself or for your child, for your neighbor, for a family member, you know what, I think I should really call the police and get them arrested and put into jail, and that's going to solve this problem. It's just not like it's not how we would help people create changes in their relationship and create ways to be better with each other. So the scope of it, I think, is tremendously huge, and we really limit ourselves when we're thinking about scope with the statistics that we're talking about and thinking about the criminal justice system, because it creates us that are okay and a them that are having problems with it.
I just want to follow up on this mandatory arrest thing before we get into some of the other discussions to talk more specifically about what each of your organizations is doing. But should the law be changed? What would you like to see happen?
I think eventually the law should be changed, but we should know what we're going to replace it with. My organization is the statewide resource for domestic violence programs across Wisconsin, also does legislative advocacy on behalf of victims across the state. I think fundamentally, one of the things about arrest and a lot of the interventions we created were out of the context of understanding really fully, as Terry is pointing out, what causes domestic violence. We didn't really go deep. We all saw it as an individual problem and thought if we just deal with the individuals who use violence, we're going to take care of it. But there's such a deep, and I want you to just think about the fact that it is connected to everything.
Yep.
It is connected to everything. I see the connection in violence to everything. So I see it as connected to abuse of the environment. We are seeing it right now at Standing Rock with the Dakota Access Pipeline, where I deeply believe that when my Native sisters tell me water is life and they are the water carriers, and abuse of the water is abuse against women, and we know that extraction systems, the extraction industry, the oil extraction industry, has been hugely dominated by trafficking of victims, female women used in those systems to service men. So there's so we have to start to think about what's the big thing. If we don't understand what causes this problem in the first place, if we don't work our brains to start to think about what really causes it, move beyond the individual and think about the systems and structures that support violence against women, gender violence, however we want to call it, we will never end it. And mandatory arrest just focus solely on individuals. So it's never going to, we can keep arresting people, we can keep serving people over and over in shelters, or in many ways, we can keep doing all of those things, and if we keep doing all of those things, we will never end gender violence. It will never end. We have to understand the connection of it to everything. We have to understand its roots in rape culture and misogyny, and really understand that in the context of the election that just happened 2 days ago, and all that we saw and experienced, and how deeply, this is not partisan for me, how deeply that election has so impacted those of us who work to end violence. Carmen's itching.
No,
So
I think eventually we do need to repeal. We need to retool the mandatory arrest, but you know, it's complex. There are those women who are beaten to death, who are stabbed, who are shot, who are murdered, who die slowly over 20, 30, 40, 50 years, being thrown down the stairs and slapped and punched and pinched and bruised, and they get up every day, which is why I have some hope today in my life, as I've witnessed in 30 years the bravery and courage of my sisters who get up, put their clothes on, get their kids to school, and do their life. So I know going into the dark that we can survive the misogyny that we are now going to be living into after this election. So I do think it needs to be changed. I do think we have not been very good at predicting lethality. We did not have many tools in 1986 when Tracy Thurman, 88, 87, when she was beaten on the East Coast. I get that wrong every time. There was a woman who was beaten to almost to death, and the cops did nothing. And the wave of mandatory arrest, pro-arrest policies across the country came out of that case. She sued, she won a civil lawsuit, and all of a sudden police departments around the country started to get on board with pro-arrest. So the inclination to intervene when a human being is being hurt in front of you is not a bad impulse. The movement was responding to this absolute exhaustion of nobody doing anything. Cops would come to your house, I'd be full of blood, and they'd say, "You're married to Patty. Patty, go walk it off. I don't care if she's breaking your jaw, slamming your fingers in the door, or stabbing you. She's married. He or she can do that to you." So it was really in response to trying to force something to happen. What we gave up, though, is our critical thinking about what we were creating. And we never took a moment. When Patty was speaking, I thought, you know, the house was on fire. When you're standing in front of a human being, the house is on fire, and you're thinking, I got to respond. We never in the movement took a moment to say to our sisters of color, what is this doing? What's the truth about this? What could we do differently? What should we be doing differently? Terry Strodoff and I have been in a conversation for about 15 years about this issue and what to do differently. So it's complicated. I also never had a woman who was hurt say, I didn't want him to stop hurting me. I wanted him to stop hurting me. I did want somebody to intervene, and I love him. So you got to stand in the middle of that complexity, and you got to analyze the intersection of racism, classism, sexism. Before we're going to be able to figure out how to solve the problem, we have to understand where we stand and the truth of what we're facing. We also, at the expense, while we were building this, we forgot to open all kinds of other doors for people to get help. We sort of waded downstream, and we've believed magically that if we punish you or make you accountable, and there's lots of good that come out of people who've gotten into treatment. I don't want this to be either or, black or white thinking. There are people who have changed, who've gone to Terry's program, our program, who have changed their behavior, but it's not enough to change the culture that we live in.
I think that we are clearly in a culture that little boys are still taught to think that they are better than little girls. They are still taught a version of very violent masculinity and a version of emotional health that is very distorted about how they can show and who they can be for their health. We live in a society where trauma for children is rampant, adversity in the home is rampant, and these are the two roots of where domestic violence lies, where violence in the family, violence in the home lies. So it's not the case then that, back up a little bit, that anybody comes to our door and they're like, hey, hello, I have a problem with this and I need you to help me, because it's very, very difficult to recognize your problem when you live in a culture that it's normalized the way that you behave. And it's normalized the way that your relationship goes. So it's weird for me to say that I feel two ways about the criminal justice system. If we look at who's in it, we know that it is filled up with people who have experienced tremendous and horrific trauma in their life. And when they've acted out from that trauma, instead of our society being able to respond to them and recognize it as trauma and being able to say, hey, you need help and you need support and you need healing, the criminal system has punished people and put them in custody and put them in jail, which does not help healing. So that's a really big problem with it. And then I have this other part of my brain that's like, but you know what? We need people to get into help, and so we need some type of something in our society that really forces people into it, because it's not the case that people very often independently recognize what's going on in their life, the men that we work with. It's very, very hard for them to recognize that because, like I said, it is something that is normalized and becoming even more normalized in the way that our culture and our society is. So I don't think that it is the right tool for the future, and I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to figure out what is that then that helps people get into a place that they can recognize what's happening with them and get some help and get some transformative change around that has some little bit of coercion around it, because that's actually something that we can work with, that we can get people into the door is what we want to do.
Terry, let me follow up on that. So describe for people, some of whom in this room know what your center does, but you work with men.
Yes.
And how do you change their lives? How do you help them heal?
Yeah. Well, we work with men primarily from the criminal system who have been generally convicted of a domestic violence-related crime. And it is true with 100% of the men that I've worked with over 15 years, that if you patiently wait for their story, you will find out that they are, in fact, victims of a tremendous amount of adversity in their life themselves, that they grew up in families that are rampant with violence, that they experienced, that they witnessed violence in their community, that they had imposed upon them what we're beginning to call gender trauma, that they were bullied into being men that act like a man, that is somebody who can't cry, that is somebody who can't be expressive in their emotions, that is somebody who thinks that they have to objectify and exploit women and lose so much of their real humanity in that, about who it is that they can be, to fit into this little, conform to this version of what it is for masculinity. So they come with all of this stuff, all of this stuff that feels to them very normal. And so they're thinking like, what? Something is, first of all, not really that anything's wrong. And then if something's wrong, then it's really wrong with them individually. So what we are able to do, I think, is to recognize that these are the little boys who have grown up in families that have experienced violence. And it's more than just socially learning that this is how men are to be. It's also the damage that happens in the emotional and psychological development of children who have grown up in this adversity and learn how to adapt their behavior around that adversity, learn how to survive. So it's no surprise then, if you grow up in an environment that is filled with adversity, that you learn things like, in order to get my needs met, I need to manipulate the people who are around me. In order to get what I want, I need to control people because that's what helps me keep myself safe, and that's what helps me get what I need. So what we do then to little boys, because we know that this they're growing up in trauma, and then we put masculinity, what we're teaching little boys about what it means to be a man, over the top of that. So the way that boys and men typically express the debility around trauma is through rage and violence. And we can recognize trauma when it's more victim behavior, and you can see like, wow, that's somebody who clearly has experienced trauma and they're recreating that. But when somebody's acting out and causing harm to their family, to our community, to people in our society, it's much harder to see that as something that is rooted in pain and in trauma. And so they're accustomed to being told that they are in fact monsters, and that's our response. We kick them out of school, we throw them into detention, then juvenile detention, and then jail. And so if we're able to actually help people resolve that, recognize what happened to them, and then take steps to heal and transform that, it is oftentimes men will say the very first time in their lives that somebody has heard their story and listened to it as though they're a human being that really experienced these things that affected them and that harmed them in ways that they need to heal and resolve. So it's a program that's really based upon healing because quite basically we know, like I said, these are the little boys who have grown up in the families that they're experiencing a lot of harm, and there's no magic that happens to them at 18. It doesn't suddenly go away, and they can be healthy in their relationship, and they can have a nurturing and respectful relationship. We wouldn't expect that if somebody had a physical injury, we wouldn't expect it to just go away with time. You know, it might heal and recover, but it would still be an injury that would cause some problems in their life. But somehow we think that people who have injuries to their soul, to their psyche and their development is just like time is going to heal that, and that's not the way that it works.
Carmen, I want to talk for a moment about the building at 6th and Center, because this is a pretty remarkable enterprise that's happening here in Milwaukee, where we're putting together so many of the people who are parts of this domestic violence issue, putting them under the same roof. Is it making a difference? Can you see that? Is there any way of knowing that so soon after moving into that building?
I think it is making a difference, Mike. I think it will over time. We have a formal evaluator. We'll be measuring. Sojourner sits still in the seat of doing what you would call traditional domestic violence services. We provide shelter. We serve anywhere from 4,500 to 5,000 people in our restraining order clinic. We help people in the criminal system. So the almost 10,000 people I described, we're in all 7 police districts. And I do think the building is a game changer, because what it does is I think it's going to allow us to be more effective and efficient with our partners and free up our energy to have more critical conversations like this, and ask ourselves as a community, Sojourner wants to take the lead on these conversations, why have we been so unwilling to really wrap our hands around children's exposure to violence? This is not rocket science. It is not rocket science. It's absolutely predictable that what Terry said will happen, and we've known that my 30 years in this field. Why have we been so unwilling to do that work, to really analyze that intersection of race and class and sexism? And I have a theory based on my own experience that we've been unwilling because we haven't done our own trauma work as healers, as individuals, as people who have been responsible for being the architects of these kinds of structures. I'm not willing to say that what we've created is all bad. I'm not fond of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think the movement built many good things, and that includes changes in the court system. We have more responsive police officers. We have non-government and government advocates, and we do have a lot of people coming forward. But it doesn't relieve us from the obligation to have this critical conversation around where have we failed. I often say, I've tried to say to our staff, we don't come to work for the 99%. We come to work for the 1% where we drop the ball. Because when we drop the ball, it has severe consequences. So the building is fabulous. It represents a dream come true. Many of my colleagues are here. We got there together. And I think the most phenomenal thing about the building is that it stands as a testament to possibility. In a time where things feel pretty dark and impossible, the fact that that building is there, because over 10 years, many people said it'll never happen. Women in the domestic violence movement across the country didn't like the Family Justice Center movement because Casey Gwen, the founder, was a right wing. There's all kinds of reasons why. People said, don't do it, Carmen. It's never going to happen. You're never going to raise the money. Well, $27 million later, the building's here. And I think it says that what we set our minds out to, we can accomplish if we do it together with other people. Terry's words for me, like I said, Terry and I have had this conversation. We've been in, and I love and respect Terry. It's been one of my greatest privileges to work with her. And I think that's what it takes to have these hard conversations. Because my energy I start twitching when Terry's talking about the truth. And we have to have loving spaces that are safe, where we can challenge each other. This is not an us and them, either or. We're not going to get to the solution if we don't create safe spaces to challenge ourselves in a loving and kind way around what we need to build for the future. And we have to build that in relationship with each other and together. Otherwise, we won't do it. And we'll end up continuing to drown in this culture where we're unwilling to see what's right in front of our face, right? I heard Marian Edelman say this summer, I happened to be at an event, she said, we really need to build, so the Family Peace Center is built like what I would want. I would want my daughter to be served there by Liz or Tawana or Lynn or Tania. I would trust my daughter or my partner to walk in the halls of that building. And Marian Edelman said, we've not had the political will. We know what we need to do, and we need to build infrastructures, programs, systems that we would want to use, simply. What would you want your brother, your father, your uncle, your sister, your aunt, your grandmother to have access to? And that's what we've tried to do on 6th and Walnut.
Can I ask you, Patty, and actually all three of you, we've been talking about restorative justice and its potential role in addressing the domestic violence problem. Is it something we should be looking at to do on a larger basis here in Milwaukee?
I think we are at a crossroads in our movement right now in the domestic violence field, and I think you heard a little bit of it both from Terry and Carmen. First, I want to address some of the things that Terry said, which is, she talked a lot about what the Alma Center is doing. It's very healing focused. I will say to you that by and large, in Wisconsin, and probably nationally this is true, most batters intervention programs are highly focused on retribution and accountability. Mm-hmm. And so this is a very different model. So I want to be clear that what you heard from her is not what happens around the state. Mm-hmm. So it's super important for us to know that because we are not at a place where we're really deeply exploring the harm that was done to perpetrators and helping to connect them back to their, to their own humanity. We have dehumanized them, and incarcerating them dehumanizes them even further. So this is a model that really is working towards reconnecting humans with their humanity, and in that they will be good souls.
Something you'd like to see, like in the
Absolutely.
state, not just in Milwaukee, not just at the Alma Center.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will say, and Terry knows this, Carmen knows this, many of the people in the room who work in this field know this, there's not a lot of data that supports that better intervention programs really actually work in the first place. So this is an area that we need to innovate. And what Alma Center is doing is full-scale innovation, trying new things that other programs aren't willing to try. And I think we'll see a change there. I really want to reflect on what Carmen said about services that we would want to go to, and that's true for both victims and offenders. Mm-hmm. People who, if a man batters his wife or girlfriend, that's somebody's son. He might be somebody's father. He's somebody's brother. And so those family members, including the victim most of the time, would hope that that person was treated with compassion. They do not wish the worst for that person, by and large. I will, again, it is so important for us to understand shades of gray here, that there is, everything is a continuum, and that there are some victims who are like literally lock him up and throw away the key because he's going to kill me, and I understand that. And there are a lot of victims who are at the other end of the spectrum, particularly people of color, and the communities of color, particularly African American communities in Wisconsin, probably nationally, but I can say in Wisconsin, have been decimated by incarceration, and decimated by incarceration. at least 50% of African American men will serve time in a prison, and that is wrong. So we have to look at what's our responsibility to that. So do I think we need to change a lot of things? I think we're open for a lot of innovation. The fact that Sojourner has built in a lot of healing work. They have, counselors and massage therapists and Reiki and acupuncture and a lot of in different spaces, a faith space where people can go and just meditate and be. Those are healing things that we haven't really had the luxury to put into domestic violence programs.
So here's the challenge. I'm thinking about two things in my career that I remember. When I said we don't know how to gauge lethality, we don't. I don't know. We know better today than we did 40 or 50 years ago. And I remember when I first started my career, an advocate told me a story about how her neighbor took his wife and teenage kids downstairs in the basement and shot them, all of them. And then he shot himself. And there were no outward signs, there were no arrests, nobody knew. My sense is there probably were things that someone could have picked up on, but didn't. And then I remember a case about 5 years ago. A woman was held hostage for about 13 hours, and she was beaten with a wrench. And police were called. She escaped that morning because he exhausted himself battering her. She was a non-speaking English woman. She was living with his mother, and she escaped when he fell asleep and the kids went off to school. And she left the house with just her underwear and bra, and she saw her oldest son turn around as she was escaping. And he looked at her in disgust. She was all battered and bruised. She was in the hospital. We ended up working with her. And it was very, very difficult for her to leave. She did not want to leave. He was going to kill her, though, if there was another episode. And I remember the advocate coming back from the court hearing. He ended up getting prosecuted. He got 17 years, I think, in jail. And the advocate came back and she said, she was sitting there and she said, my head feels fuzzy. I have to read this victim impact statement and I don't know, I can't track. And she started to tell the advocate about all these times he had stomped on her head with a boot till her ear bled, multiple episodes of this horrific violence that had happened in her life. And as Terry said, we've built a movement as if that's the only kind of case there is, and that's not true. That's a smaller percentage, but the system is built as if that's the only case. And we helped her get to she had traumatic brain injury, and we helped her get some assessments. But I'm not sure that if you had asked her what she wanted, if she would have said she wanted to leave. She ended up leaving. We helped her, got her an apartment with her 3 kids. They were reunited. Her kids were taken away. So when I talk about complexity, that's what I'm talking about. We have to stand in the middle of that and honor and respect her autonomy and try to figure out how to give her the resources and tools. We have to ultimately accept that it's her decision to go back, and if she gets murdered, that is something that I can't prevent, right? And so when we talk about mandatory arrest, it was built out of the tension of not being able to stand that place, right? So we overreached, we forgot about autonomy and self-determination a little bit, and we built this thing that wasn't the right tool. So that's the things I'm sitting here thinking about, right? We treat everybody as if they're that perpetrator, which is wrong. We have the wrong tools. I'm afraid we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't know how to help our sisters of color. They haven't had a seat at the table. We desperately need change because we have kids right now today going to bed in Milwaukee who are learning exactly what Terry described, who are going to be the people who are going to be in our treatment programs 10 years from now. Anyway, those are my reflections.
Do you have space in your building? If you wanted to do something like restorative justice, could you do it in the center? Yeah, it's Sojourner.
We do. In fact, Janine has an office in the center, and it's my dream. So Terry and I have been dreaming about a 3-pronged program, and Janine's been part of my dream. I don't feel like I have the right to stand in between anybody and their desire to heal. I have to make that possible in whatever way that looks like for them. I also have to stand true to some things that we know are helpful. For every battered woman, the 10,000 women who come to us and want a restraining order, I have an obligation to help them with that, regardless of what community they live in, what they want. Tawana's got to be kind and treat people with respect when they come to us for case management. We got to do it all at one time. We're trying to open up the possibility of, we did the surrogate conversations with Terry. Mm-hmm. I just looked at Terry, I said, we got so much work to do. We have this vision of people doing their individual work, bringing people together. Like, I do think if you want to sit with your perpetrator, you should have that opportunity eventually. My job is to figure out how to make it safe down the road. But I can't participate in it unless you've made a commitment to doing your own work. Mm-hmm. So you go through Terry's program or you go through Beyond Abuse, then we'll talk about how I can help make it safe. If you've done any of your trauma work, you know how crazy you can go when you fall into that deep, dark place in yourself, right? All of us have been hurt. You know how that can make you crazy? I've been crazy. I've been broken open with my own broken heart. And in those moments, I will tell you, I don't know what to do. It is so hard to stand in that place. We have to be the space holders for people when they go there, individually, collectively, and then Terry and I talked about bringing families together. We're counting on Janine to help us figure it out.
Terry, you want to?
Well, I think that our current system is adversarial and built upon English common law, right? And it turns out to me, I don't think that that we maybe English common law is not the brightest bulb in the tree, because we have a lot of, it's the law that allowed us to have slavery. It's the law that has allowed us to do many horrendous things in the name of, we've created laws around that, right? And I think that if we look back to other cultures and to other ways that people handle conflict and ways that people handle harm that they've caused to each other, we can have different kinds of insight. And restoration is something that is has deep, deep roots in how communities work with each other and how communities hold each other accountable. So it seems to me like this very much more natural way that people solve problems with each other. I don't know if anybody watches the new Daily Show with Trevor Noah or saw him in the New York Times Magazine last week, and it was a question about something that really strikes him about being in the United States. He's from South Africa, took over Jon Stewart's spot. Pretty much, he's funny too. But he said that it strikes him to come from a land that had apartheid, that it was a tumor that happened in the people's lives. And when it ended, you could say, oh, there's the tumor, and we need to cut it out, and we need to restore we need to fix it. We need to fix it. But in the United States, we have a disease that takes over our entire body, and we are so accustomed to the disease that we think it's health. So we don't know how to actually recover from that. We don't even know that we're sick, so we don't know how to recover from it. And so restoration is this idea to me. It's a concept that is really, really deeply rooted in the way that we recover the truth of who we are, all of us, that we recover our connection to our soul. And it makes so much sense, particularly when you think about it in relationships, because our relationships, to me, create our humanity. They help us know who we are. And to punish people over relationship and to say, adversarial, like I win and I need to eviscerate the other side, it just doesn't help us move forward.
I want to go back to my earlier comment about everything being connected and reflect on restoration for an individual means restoration for a community. I mean, it isn't just one person who's restored. It spreads like ripples. That if we start thinking beyond retribution and think about restoration, our communities may be in a better place to heal themselves as well.
Yeah, there's a group of us executive directors that are doing a pilot class about our own healing and how that relates, because we can't go any further than we've gone ourselves. So if you're carrying around some trauma, I grew up in a violent home. I know how that's impacted me. I got to be intimate with that. I got to be familiar with that because it's going to impact what I create and what I think is possible. And so we're looking at our own need to heal. So if we don't understand that when a person heals, they heal for seven generations back and seven generations forward, we miss the opportunity of understanding the awesome responsibility we have to help people, right? Connect and their relationship to the community. So I think our own healing has kept us blind, has kept us sick, has kept us unwilling to help other people, because if we can't heal ourselves, how could we offer that to anybody else? That's why addiction has been such a great medicine for people in this country. It is the medicine that has allowed broken people to continue to get up every day, dress, and do their lives, because it's the only thing they can do when they're so broken. And we live in a culture that says, we don't care if you're broken. I don't care what you saw when you told that story about that young man who, whose mother was shot. We don't know how to hold space for that. And we grow up and we become architects of these things that we think magically won't be impacted by our own trauma. Anyway, it's a complicated thing.
Let me take questions from the audience. We have about 15 minutes left. Raise your hand, press down on the rim. If you're in the back, we'll get a microphone to you in a moment. Hang on a second, okay? In the meantime, let's take your question. Yes, sir.
It worked. The question seems to be most of the emphasis has been on adult partners, married or not married, but hasn't been any talk about adult children having to go home and the domestic abuse of the child to the parents or the parents to the child. Sure. And one area I've become very aware of recently is the lack of housing. And the lack of housing from somebody transitioning from inpatient mental health care to outpatient mental health care and no suitable place to live. Some families will take their, what was a child, but now an adult child then, and then the problems start. And I've become aware of many suicides, accidental overdoses, deliberate overdoses, and one case just going in the garage, turning the car on, and not opening the car door. So it's not always drugs that's involved or a gun that's involved. I'd like to hear more about this problem within the families and children not being able to get the care they need.
Well, it's my vision. I think we have abandoned our young people and kids, because I think we were abandoned and we've had to grow up and deny all the things I said previously. I have a vision that every kid who witnesses, and here's where I get nervous, because when we start talking about building structures, kids who witness violence should be given opportunities to talk about what they've seen and the experiences they've had, as close to the incident as possible. We have an estimated 3.3 million kids in this country who have witnessed and are witnessing violence. And we're not doing a lot about that until they grow up and get in children's court and start causing problems, and then have problems that we have to arrest them for. I think we need to look at restorative policies for kids who witness violence in our schools, in our churches, in our community centers that are community-based, that help kids unravel. But we also, so as I'm saying that, I think we also have to invest in making adults healthy. We have to do both at the same time.
So as we talk about this stuff, I really want to say our examination really requires us to look at what we've done that we want to keep, that we think is good, and that we want to move forward into our forward work. We need to evaluate what either didn't work or no longer works, what we should shed. And we also need to look at where we're going to go into our future. What do we want to push out into the world as new and innovative? The issue around kids is really complicated. I really want to talk about mandatory reporting, as Carmen's whispering it to me, that we've abandoned our kids, but one of the things is that so many people in our world are mandatory reporters. Domestic violence advocates in Wisconsin are not, unless they have a licensure that requires them to report, such as a master's in social work or something like that. But There are so many people who are mandatory reporters who report. This is a discussion about systems. So we have a system, it's called the Child Welfare System, Child Protective System, CPS people call it. And it, as an intervention system, has not been very successful. When we talk about kids, that's one thing. Part of the reason why we don't get into talking about kids who witness so much is because 15, 20 years ago, we did start doing that. And then Child Protective Services would swoop in and take the kids from the protective parent, take the kids away from the mother who was the protective parent, saying that she had failed to protect her children from abuse when she couldn't protect herself, that her kids were witnessing abuse daily. They weren't holding the abattoir accountable for that. They were holding the protective parent accountable. And so we all bailed out. Oh, hold up, and worked to pass a lot of laws saying that Child Protective Services couldn't do that. So everything we have done has been so reactive, and we have really failed in many ways to really do deep thinking. We've created these huge, this architecture of systems that don't really that don't have the complexity to really understand. They're the sort of blunt force tools like mandatory arrest. Child Protective Services has become a blunt force tool as well. Here in Milwaukee, children of color, African American children, are far more likely to be ripped away from their families than white children. And so with all that we have done, we're able to look now and see what the disparate impacts have been. And it has not been pleasant. So we have to really evaluate what those systems are and figure out a new pathway into our future. So we're not there yet.
If your question was about, yes, we do have kids who are growing into adults who are returning home and battering their parents. Absolutely. The oldest woman who called the hotline was 90 years old. She lived in an abusive marriage for 60 years. After her husband died, her son beat her for another 20. Kids learn, we live into what we learn, which is why our own healing and providing healing opportunities as soon as we can is critically important for all of us. But yes, that is a pattern, and there's not enough housing for anybody.
Right.
And
I want to say that 20% of domestic homicides in Wisconsin are of older adults. The vast majority are of adult sons killing their parents.
see if we can get to a couple more questions just in the back, please. If you can keep it brief, that would be great.
Could one of the systems you're talking about in Milwaukee be an incorporation of communities of faith? How could that help?
It depends on who the pastor was in the church. So if you have a pastor that understands the dynamic and isn't saying things like, God wants you to go and make this marriage work, I don't want to hear about your abuse, read your scripture, sister, go home, do what you have to do to make your husband happy, you're in it till the end. If you have someone who is not of that thinking, I think the faith community is a place that people look to for restoration and healing. It's a natural environment. If the church is willing to stand up and think critically about this issue and examine the leaders who would be leading that program, as we all have to.
Let me go over here quickly. Yes? It is supposed to work, but apparently it's not.
I just want to honor the women on this panel and the women on the panel before this for doing the really hard work of standing in the complicated, scary places as Carl described it. And your bravery is really a balm to my spirit that I needed this week. So I should
Thank you.
That's nice. Let me go over here to Judge Kremers.
So I get why victims would be inclined to take part in restorative justice, and hopefully we'll hear more about this tomorrow. There are lots of benefits to them. But for the perpetrators, I'm wondering, given the responsivity issue where they get all the benefits out of using violence to control a relationship, you don't see any benefit in the immediate future from taking part in something like this. How do we get them to take part in these programs if there isn't some coercive force to get them to do that?
Okay. I think that I don't want to backtrack on what I was just saying, that I think there is some requirement to get people into programming, but then it is our job as people who hold space for other people to heal, to get people ready to walk into that space. And that is a very, very hard thing to do, and it means it is based on what Carmen said, to do our own authentic healing ourselves so that we're able to be in space with somebody with compassionate accountability, to actually hold them responsible for acts that they did, because here's the reality, trauma happens to people, right? It affects the way that we develop emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, but we are not our trauma. And so if we choose to stay in it, if we choose to continue with the problem behavior, if we choose to continue to repeat the packages, continue with the adaptation, that's our grown-up choice, and we need to be responsible for those things and accountable for those things, because at any point, however difficult it is, people can change and they can heal. And when people begin to open up to a process that they're not going to be judged as a monster, that they're actually going to be heard and they're going to be understood, they recognize far more quickly than you can ever imagine that they are broken. They see it right away, because they're not all about telling everybody else, pushing everybody else away to protect themselves inside, because they've spent their whole lives doing that, pushing everybody away to try to stay safe inside. So as soon as you can give room for many people, not for everybody, but again, with patience over time for most everybody, people begin to recognize that they are broken, and they're able to have some vulnerability around that brokenness. And the vulnerability around the brokenness means that you're able to also connect with other people who are broken, and you're able to see, like, wow, we're in this dance because we're both carrying trauma. We both are carrying the energy of the pain that's inside of us, and it makes sense that we are in this together, because somebody who's not broken is not going to make a lot of sense to me, And so when people begin to recognize that they're broken, I think that there is a natural, that what we've experienced is they want to be well. They're sick of the pain. They're sick of the consequence of going in and out of custody. They're sick of people not liking them. They're sick of waking up in the morning and feeling pretty miserable. It seems like there's benefits to that because you get what you want, maybe, but the benefits are very instrumental and very immediate, and people really at the core, people still want love and compassion. No baby pops into this world and is like, oh, I can't wait to grow up and hurt and harm the people who I love, in my family. It's not the way that it happens. Every baby is born just wants to give love and receive love. And we build, because of the trauma and the pain that we experience, we build like a barbed wire meshing around our heart, but it's still there, it's still there. And people still want to connect around that reality.
I also think that there was some good when the community in this country stood up and said, you cannot do this. Right. To another human being. We will not tolerate that. That's really what we started to do with mandatory arrest. We said, we will not tolerate this behavior, and you have to stop, and you have to be accountable, right? There is value in that. Battered women have said, when the state took it out of my hands and you made it your responsibility, I felt better. It relieved me of this conflict in my heart, right? So that's what when Patty says we can't throw the baby out in the bathwater, we can't. We have to look at every single piece and keep what's valuable. So while we're holding space for programs like Alma, we also have to be the people who say, I won't tolerate that women and adult parents are killed by their sons or their daughters or people who use violence, you have to stop. And then we have to be responsible to create opportunities for them to change. And then we have to get upstream and open the doors. Why aren't we talking to parents when they have babies about the health of their relationship? Why isn't every church preaching about this? This is not rocket science again. So what I want to say is, yes, we need this, but we also need a line in the sand.
Right.
Patty, I'm going to give you the final word, I think.
Final word.
Oh my gosh. I had such a brilliant thought when you were talking.
You could just end there.
It just blew. I know we are old. So I really want to say, when we're sort of talking about mandatory arrest as something that needs replacing. And I really want to emphasize it needs replacing. You know, we can't just pull something back and then go into the void and expect communities to repair themselves. It's on all of us. I really believe strongly that it's on all of us, not just the professionals in this room to create the new thing. It's on all of us. It's on communities who are concerned about violence to think about what it may look like in the future. It's not just for one person. It's, you know, I think what we learned in the past was based upon a horrific domestic violence near homicide in Torrington, Connecticut, many years ago, whatever year that happened. I think 85, but you know, with this idea swept the nation as the panacea. And we really quickly learned that it was applied not the same to all people. I worked in a prosecutor's office for 7 years, and I saw that when Badger football coaches beat their wife, they didn't get prosecuted. Mm-hmm. They didn't get prosecuted. Mm-hmm. You know, nothing happened to them. And you all know that case, that coach left Badgers and went to Ohio and continued to beat his wife there, or Iowa, and continued to beat his wife there. So we see that being poor, and this is across the board for our justice system. If you're poor, if you're a person of color, if you're a person who has a developmental or psychiatric disability, the system doesn't respond the same to you or if you're an immigrant, or like name any other thing. The system isn't responding the same to everybody. Nor do I actually think there should be equality necessarily. There should be fairness. So it's on us to think about what a fair system looks like, a system that moves beyond retribution, unless we really truly believe this is a situation which requires retribution and there is no other choice, that we are abandoning trying to restore the humanity of this human, but that we should first think about using that justice system as an arm to get people into healing processes that they might not otherwise connect to on their own. And this is what we have to create, and we have to create it with a sense of fairness and humanity across the board.
I think that's a great place for us to end today. Before we go, I just want to tell everybody we'll be back at it at 9 o'clock tomorrow, Janine, is that correct? 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. We hope to see many of you back here. We want to say thank you for your interest and your attention. And again, thanks to our last panel, Terry Sturdoff, Carmen Petrie, and Patty Seeger. Thank you.